But welcome everyone to today's webinar. I am Catherine Stanley. I am the AirTAP program coordinator. And so I'll just do a little overview about AirTAP in this webinar series, and then I will hand it over, as I said, to our presenters. Okay, again, welcome everyone to our winter webinar series. This webinar series is sponsored by MnDOT's Office of Aeronautics and administered by the Airport Technical Assistance Program, also known as AirTAP. We are located at the Center for Transportation Studies at the University of Minnesota. So if you aren't unfamiliar with AirTAP, we began in 2000. It is the first of its kind in the nation, offering practical yet specialized training and resources across the state for those who operate, maintain, and administer Minnesota's public use airports. Minnesota's general aviation personnel across the state have had access to targeted information and training to reduce costs and improve the safety, quality, and the overall efficiency of airport operations. AirTAP also helps airport staff build a community network for exchanging best practices and learning from one another. So AirTAP provides 4 major services. One is our education and training. So in addition to the webinars we've been offering, we also assist with the annual airport conference and any other one-off event throughout the year, if it's an FAA workshop or if it's additional training that's required or requested, we're able to put that together. We also provide technical assistance, we provide access to experts, and we have resources and printed materials on our website. So as I mentioned, this is actually a series of webinars we're putting on. Today is Understanding the Grant Process. On January 13th, we have another one called Understanding Your Airport Lighting Systems and How to Maintain It. And our final one is in February, and that will be a panel discussion on understanding the airport and the airport's role, airport manager's role. All these sessions are being recorded and will be available on our website. And finally, if you are new to Zoom, this is what your control panel looks like along the bottom. So you can mute yourself if you want to talk directly with the speakers. You can show your video if you want, especially when not screen sharing. You can view all the participants. And in the chat, if you could put questions throughout directly in the chat, that would be wonderful, because we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. And then again, it's being recorded. And so now I am going to hand it over to Tom Clavin's going to be presenting the material. Erica will be one of the speakers. So there we go. We see it.
I can kind of introduce myself first, and then Tom can introduce himself, and then I'll start the presentation. I'm Erica Johnson. I work with the airport development staff with MnDOT and have been here for just about a year now, and am graduated from Mankato back in 2013 and made my way over to MnDOT just this past year.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tom Clavin. I also work in airport development. I am an assistant engineer in the North Regions, work with Matt Lavins in that area.
All right. So our presentation today is on understanding the grants process. Kind of an overview. The grants process is a continuously planning process. So there's kind of 4 key things that we kind of talk about with different airports and stuff, is like our master plan. Your master plan kind of generates the inventory and the size and type of airport, and as well as numbers of operations and what is currently using the airport and your anticipated growth over 20 years. This helps identify, for future project needs, especially if, you have a lot of anticipated growth in years to come. You also have your airport layout plan, kind of the current and future facility requirements. And this is kind of shown on a map or, on a drawing. And it can help identify and mitigate potential conflicts, and then also help phase projects. Then you have the capital improvement plan, which is the CIP. And this is based on the phasing of projects over the next 20 years. And it kind of puts your individual request in and identify for each fiscal year what you want to do. So it helps you plan out those projects. And then finally, your grant request, which is what we're all here to talk about. And every fiscal year, a list of the statewide requests are compiled, prioritized, and grant offers are made from MnDOT to you for statewide. And then also FAA has theirs as well. Next slide, Tom. All right. So the CIP, to get to it, if everybody knows, you can go to the DOT website. Up at the top, you'll see an airplane. You click on that, it comes to MnDOT's Aeronautics and Aviation page. So you can click on Airports tab, and then you can go to the Airport Development section, and there's your CIP at the top. And then you have many options to look at. And I'll talk about it, or Tom or I will talk about it at the end too. But if you're having difficulties logging into your CIP, you'll be able to talk to, I know we're kind of phasing out Internet Explorer, and it sounds like it's going to be easier to go into Microsoft Edge. So Dan Bonnier, who's our Central Region engineer, who's on the call today as well, he is kind of our lead guy on the CIP, so he'll help you out. But we, again, will have kind of a note at the end here about that. So here's kind of just an overview of what the main page on the CIP looks like. Kind of gives you the years on the left-hand side of what fiscal year you're planning a project name, what the status of that project is, and then your type, whether it's for the apron, taxi lane, fuel system, other types like that, what you're looking for funding, whether it's for FAA, state, and local, kind of your split. So this kind of is where you go to put in all your projects. And then our state project prioritization. So a big thing, is how we decide, what projects. Now, this is just a very base project score. There's a lot of, there's quite a few different things that go into it. But this is kind of the first key step that we put in for how we prioritize different projects. But there's definitely, more, different factors that go into it other than what you see here. All right, now going into the state grant process. So before a grant is even offered, you want your project to be shown on the airport layout plan if it's applicable. Next, you're going to want to enter in your project onto your CIP, as you saw before what the CIP looks like. And if you have trouble again logging in, just contact us and we'll help you with that. So for this next fiscal year, 2023, you must have these projects entered in by the end of January, on January 31st, 2022. So next month, at the end of next month. And then we compile and download, or we take what we call a snapshot of the statewide CIP on or after February 1st. We try to do it February 1st. Sometimes it ends up later. And then we start to prioritize the projects based on the formula, but also the availability of funding and then other factors. After grant offers are distributed, so once we get all those compiled and look at what funding we have, the different buckets, we sent out grant offers. Now your grant offer must be accepted and you have to send in a formal grant request to your airport development section. So whether you're in the central, north, or south. State funds will then be encumbered and agreement distributed for approval once we get your formal grant request. Sponsors, you have to receive an authorization to proceed, which is an executed grant by email before beginning any work on the project. If you complete any work prior to the grant being executed and sent out, it will no longer be it'll be ineligible for all future funding without exception. So what we look for is when those invoices are dated. So if you send in an invoice and the grant wasn't executed until, November 1st, let's say, but you send in a invoice that's dated from September 1st, we will not be able to accept that, and that invoice will not be paid. and that includes design and project formulation. Next is the state approval process. So once we submit, once MnDOT will submit an agreement to the sponsor for approval, so this is talking about that agreement. This is what we require back from you once we send you the agreement. You need to have a resolution from the council adopting the agreement. So that has to include the state project and state agreement number, and then identify at least one individual to sign. And you can be as many as you want, or as many as the local government or whoever is over the airport requires. And it generally must be notarized or include a seal. If you can't do that, just contact us. We'll help you with it. We do send you a basic resolution when we send out the agreement, but if you prefer to use a different resolution, you can do that as well. And then, of course, the agreement, which has to be signed by the individuals designated in the resolution. It has to occur after the adoption of the resolution. And then return those copies, resolution agreement, to MnDOT, and you can do that by email. So you can either sign them by hand and scan them in, or you can digitally sign them. And then we have to route that through our state signature. So it goes through quite a few different places on our side. And then once it's signed, then we send and that's the fully executed agreement. So one issue talking about before, about trying to get reimbursements before the grant is executed. These are our Chapter 16 issues. So it's possible to begin work before the grant is executed if an early encumbrance of funds is made, but you can't get a reimbursement until that fully executed grant is received. We, as airport development staff, recommend you wait until that contract is executed. But if there is something that, you know, has your hands tied, or something that you need to, for some reason, start a little bit earlier, please contact us first before you start any work, even if you have been given the grant agreement or anything, because we need to tell you that you can proceed, because if we receive anything before that grant is executed, we can't pay for it. And here's an example of a state obstruction removal grant, kind of just giving you a little step-by-step. You know, you get identified from like a 5010 inspection that you need an obstruction removal. So what you do is you go out, estimate the cost and reimbursement rate, and enter that project onto your CIP for the correct fiscal year, whether that be your next fiscal year or the next, you know, whenever they say that you definitely need to have that obstruction removed. Once that grant offer is made from the state, you submit the grant request, and MnDOT sends the agreement and adopts the resolution, or you send back the resolution and the signed agreement, and then we will execute that agreement. When you receive the executed contract from MnDOT, you can begin work on the project. Credit applications can be submitted to MnDOT for reimbursement through email. And then once you come up to your last credit application, let us know, say it's the final credit application, and then that project can be closed. And I'll hand it over to Tom for the federal.
All right, I'm going to give a brief overview of the federal application and closeout process, and then do a couple updates on the federal COVID relief funding, and then a couple reminders on MNO at the end. So the federal process is very similar to the state process, and they have to identify the project scope and cost and the capital improvement plan. So that project needs to be identified in the CIP with a price for that fiscal year that's going to be requested in. The FAA is going to typically conduct CIP meetings every year in the late summer, early fall, kind of identify that 1 to 3 year plan. If there's any conflicts in that phasing that needs to happen, the whole work goes out then. If there's an environmental review process that needs to happen as part of that project, that should be done before that application gets submitted. Sponsors should send a project pre-application in the fall every year before that application is going to be due. So that should go both to MnDOT and FAA. MnDOT's going to have to review that application and fill out the official form that goes to FAA for that. The pre-application is going to include a project narrative, which kind of describes what's being proposed, project cost breakdown with estimate of those costs, pre-application checklist, and then a project sketch if there's going to be any construction. And then that final grant submittal is going to be due in the spring. So after bids or quotes are received and you have a better idea of what those costs are going to be, those final grant applications will be put together. Those should be submitted to MnDOT. MnDOT's going to have to put in the final application form to FAA. Usually we like those a couple weeks before they're actually due. And last year's deadline was May 3rd, so a couple weeks before that. MnDOT's then going to review that submittal or that pre-application form or the final application form and submit that to FAA. The final grant submittal, like I said, includes cost estimates with an overall project cost breakdown and what the federal, state, and local shares are going to be. That'll be based on the professional services agreement costs and then the construction bid tabs. It'll include a more complete project narrative, documentation of that SAMS registration has to be renewed every year. The FAA Form 5100, Exhibit A property map doesn't have to be submitted with the application, but there should be a current map on file with FAA. And then a project sketch if that's appropriate for the project. So the last couple of years, the FAA has been doing electronic grant agreements. So sponsors have to designate an individual to sign on their behalf and also who their attorney is to sign it as well. They'll send that link by email to individuals and they can complete their Adobe signature through that process. And once that final signature is obtained, the grant agreement is fully executed and can be distributed to the sponsor. And in Minnesota, whenever there's a federal grant for airport funds, there also has to be a state companion grant. So that's in Minnesota Statute Section 360. It's referred to as the Channeling Act or Companion Agreement. You're not going to see that language in the actual statute, but basically what it means is that MnDOT's going to have to apply for the grant on behalf of the sponsor and also process any of the reimbursement. So it'll be submitted to MnDOT. MnDOT will submit it to FAA. And basically what that does is that helps ensure that that project planning between the federal and the state happens cooperatively rather than independently. This is just an example where the federal grant process would look like for pavement maintenance. So say you identify you have a need for either a crack seal or seal coat. You'll identify what an estimate of that cost is going to be and get on the CIP for the fiscal year that you want to pursue that in. You work with your consultant to develop a scope of work. You might have a CIP meeting with FAA, discuss the upcoming projects if that's appropriate. Get that pre-application submitted in the fall. After bids are obtained, get the final application to MnDOT and FAA. MnDOT will submit that SF-424 application. And then FAA will issue the grant for execution and MnDOT will issue a state companion agreement. After those grants are executed, project invoices can be submitted for reimbursement. And once the final costs are known, that closeout report can be drafted and approved and that final payment can be made. Just a couple of reminders on projects. Don't start work until that grant is authorized. There are some federally eligible expenses that can be incurred prior to that grant being in place. As far as state-only costs, like Erica said, a lot of those cannot be incurred prior to that encumbrance. So it's really important that you wait until either that encumbrance is in place or better yet, wait until that grant is fully executed. Even when you do incur costs before that grant is executed, that reimbursement cannot take place until that grant is executed. So any costs that are incurred are going to be delayed until that process is complete. On grants, my recommendation is don't wait to submit credit application until the end of that project. That's fine if you do, but one of the things I've noticed is that over time, if you wait till the end of the project, a lot of those costs can be omitted or missed. So you might miss a cost for administrative costs or an engineering invoice or something like that. So it's just a lot easier to submit them as you incur them. And make sure to include the appropriate documentation for that credit application. If you have any questions about what's been submitted to MnDOT to date, just reach out to your regional engineer. They can provide you with reports of what that looks like and what's been reimbursed to date. And one of the reminders, just at the end of a project, when you get that final invoice, make sure to submit that credit application promptly so we can start that process of closing out that project. So this is just a quick overview of what that closeout process looks like. It's going to begin after 90% of those costs are incurred or reimbursed on the project. No additional reimbursement can take place until that closeout report is actually approved by FAA. So the next step would be that sponsor, make sure that they get all the final invoices paid and the credit application submitted. That closeout report can be drafted and signed. MnDOT will then audit those costs in the report and compare those to what's been submitted in the credit applications. They'll sign the report, send it to FAA. FAA will review and then authorize that final payment. And if there are any amendments that are needed, those will be processed at that time, and then final reimbursement will be dispersed. So if you have any questions about what's actually in a closeout report, FAA has a good standard operating procedure on their website that talks about that process. AirTAP's also developing some additional guidance on just what the overall process looks like. So it doesn't go what's in the report, but it'll look at what steps are involved and who's responsible at each step of that process. And as far as the state grant process, there's an e-learning module on MnDOT's website. So again, if you go to mndot.gov, click on the airplane and then go to Airport Manager Resources, all the e-learning modules can be found there. And then you just click on the state grant process to watch that. And like Erica said, if you're having trouble signing into your CIP, reach out to Dan Berner. If you have issues either with your login credentials or just accessing the software. I know a lot of companies are switching away from Microsoft Internet Explorer and going to Microsoft Edge, and you have to change some of the settings in order to use CIP on there. So if you have any questions, then reach out to Dan. So over the last year, there have been 3 different federal programs for COVID relief funding. Started with CARES 2 years ago, and then this last year filled up with CRISA and ARPA. Basically, that's designed to provide some operations and maintenance costs to offset some of the revenue losses due to COVID-19. MnDOT's role in that is basically we'll receive those credit applications from the sponsor and we'll submit those into the federal system. Once those get approved, we'll get that reimbursement and disperse that to the sponsor. So the actual review is happening by FAA. So if you have any questions on eligibility or how you can use those funds, FAA is probably your best resource to reach out to on that. For CARES, MnDOT had a standard invoice summary that we provided in a spreadsheet to use for that. For CRISA and ARPA, we don't have that standard spreadsheet. Anything that any format the sponsor wants to use is fine, but it should follow those FAA guidelines on their frequently asked questions site. The main contact for MnDOT is Crystal Nichols. She came on board here about a year ago and has been running with CRISA and ARPA. Jessica McBroom is probably going to take a bigger role with ARPA. She came on board here in the last few weeks, so she gets up to speed here, she'll be picking up with that. And then just a couple of reminders on MNO. If you have any remaining 2021 MNO, generally those expenses can still be submitted even if they're incurred up through the end of the month here. Couple of things, if the sponsors in the NIPIAS, you have to make sure all your CARES funds have been used first. And we will draw down any MNO until that's used up. And then just make sure that there are no invoices that get submitted under both CARES and MNO, because that'll cause it to get rejected. And the last thing is just if you are still claiming expenses in your 2021 MNO, make sure there's an executed extension of time amendment for that. And then for 2022 MNO, if you're submitting first quarter expenses, just make sure that your fully executed grant is in place. Otherwise, we won't be able to process that reimbursement until that is complete. And this year, airports have the option to flex part of that allocation for expenses like equipment that wouldn't be traditionally eligible under MNO. So if you're doing that, I think all those grants are being processed now. So if your MNO agreement isn't in place because of that, I think reach out to your regional engineer. They should be able to finalize that soon. And that's all we had. So if you guys have any questions, we can answer those now. Otherwise, we can give you a half hour of your time back.
Hey, Tom, just one more thing on, this is Erica, one more about that flex program is if they request to do the flex, they have to send in the grant request for that piece of equipment, like a letter with a quote, so we know how much to take off before we can execute that MNO for that state fiscal year 2022 MNO. That's what Jenny was saying for us when I talked to her yesterday. So once she knows what to take off, the amount for that piece of equipment. So if you have like a $20,000 piece of equipment and you get $50,000 for your MNO, once we know, okay, the quote's for 20,000 and we can start that, she can take that amount off that grant and then execute it. Otherwise, that's all I had to add quick to that. So if there's any questions.
Thanks, Tom and Erica. I'm wondering if you could kind of let people know what the calendar year is or what the fiscal year is for the state versus the FAA and how that kind of works with your coming up for your 2023 projects.
Yeah, sure. For the state state grant process and the state fiscal year. The state fiscal year runs from July through June. So July 1st starts a new fiscal year and the end is always June 30th. So when we started, and so it's quite different a lot of the time from, you know, cities' fiscal years, which sometimes run from January to December. And then also the federal fiscal years from September until end of August. So sometimes it gets a little bit confusing. So that's why we request for your CIP to have stuff in by January 31st so we can start looking at fiscal year 2023, which will be coming up next July, and get those grant offers out during, you know, the summer and stuff, and start getting stuff together for the next fiscal year.
Thank you. I'm also wondering if you can maybe describe what a formal grant request looks like. So once the sponsor receives the email that they're getting a grant, the next step is for them to send in a formal grant request. I'm wondering if you can kind of explain what you would like to see on those.
Yeah, for state grant request, what we expect to have is usually something on the city letterhead, and whether it's from, you know, whoever's kind of heads up or is one of those people that, you know, signs these documents. Usually we get it from them, a city administrator or city clerk. But requesting talks about, you know, what your request is, you know, that you got the grant offer, and we would like to see also a quote attached to it showing your amount. And again, if you think that, you know, the amount might change in the future, that's okay. We'll sometimes, depending on the amount or whatever, we can do an amendment towards the end of the project if need be. But what we're looking for is just something on a city letterhead stating the project, the request, the cost, kind of a cost breakdown or quote attached to it with the total amount from the city. I don't know, Dan, if you have anything extra you like to add to that or like to see, but that's normally what I've been seeing in the past year.
Yeah, yeah, I usually just tell people you're formally requesting a grant from us, and then include all the costs that you want to cover in there. So don't forget anything in the costs.
And then I don't know, Tom, if you want to talk about for a federal kind of, but that's kind of a special more because they have their own kind of process too.
Yeah, so generally that's going to follow this one. I've got the slide pulled up here, but just get that cost estimate with the overall project cost breakdown. Those costs should be based on the professional services agreement and the construction bid tabs. Usually for any administrative costs, those can be estimated at the time because those are a little bit harder to predict and they're a little more variable as well. That project cost narrative, the documentation, SAM's registration, FAA form 5100. Make sure that Exhibit A property maps on file, or either get it submitted with the application, and then get that project sketch submitted as well.
Thank you. Are there any other questions that people have about either the state or federal grant process? Well, I'm not hearing any. So I want to thank Erica and Tom for their time today. As always, you can reach out to them with any questions that you have. Yeah, so thank you everyone for attending, and we look forward to seeing everyone again in January at the next AirTAP session.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.